So nice to have you. Always a pleasure chatting to you. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Leanne. Thank you for inviting me.
Quite a heated conversation, this one, on privatization. And I must say, the conversation that Sakina and Dawie had yesterday really got sort of people talking and looking at the pros and cons of privatizing these state entities. So let me come out and ask you, what is your view on the suggestion that the state must hand over the running of some of these facilities and entities to allow for privatization?
Well, let me frame my discussion on the basis of Noam Chomsky, who talks about the question of privatization. Then from there, I'll advance the evidence that what might be best for South Africa based on that evidence, and then suggest through experiences of countries elsewhere why such a notion that that is a solution is a false basis for that argument of saying that privatization would be the best for public entities. However, I'll also advance why such under state control is failing. Let me say what Chomsky says. He says you defund, people make sure that things don't work, people get angry, privatize and sell the stuff for free to the private sector. That's the trend that has actually happened in South Africa. It is because of a particular macroeconomic posture that government has taken. The government wants to suggest that it wants to be a developmental state. A developmental state is regulatory and developmental in its orientation. In South Africa, the state has tried to only be regulatory and rather than being developmental, except although it wants to suggest that it wants to be developmental. And that's where the key failure is about the way the state wants to, and therefore started selling out the jewels of the nation to the detriment of the poor, because state intervention and state management of assets such as Eskom, such as SAA, such as Transnet, has been developmental. And going back to the apartheid state, with all the bad things of discrimination and ensuring that blacks couldn't succeed, had these instruments under the state. And it succeeded. In a way, the apartheid state was actually a developmental state. It was regulatory and developmental in orientation, except that was only for whites. And those institutions succeeded. What has been raising yesterday may suggest that under black authority and therefore blackness suggests that cannot run a state, and the private sector can. And that's a false suggestion. And I think we should be able to confront that approach to our affairs of a racist undertones that blacks have failed. Of course, in the case of the black government of South Africa, it is true that they have failed. And those institutions that they were purported to run have failed. But it was not only government. There was always a private sector on the other side. The government doesn't manufacture parts or component parts for Eskom. The government doesn't manufacture aeroplanes. The government runs Eskom and runs those institutions and invests in them. And the private sector actually builds components, helps assembling them, and so on. So there is the private sector on the other side with government. So it can't be that government is failing. It's both the private sector and the government that have failed us so badly in this country. And the answer cannot lie in the belief that private sector actually is not corrupt.
Yeah.
And it's more efficient. It cannot be
Interesting.
on an institution.
Interesting perspectives you bring up there. By the private sector, it certainly is, and I mean, as you say, it's both to blame. So that is one way of looking at it. It is, but week after week, we see videos of protests on the national highway. That, I mean, this is what's happening now. That's connecting the main port of Durban to the economic hub of Gauteng. You know, it's showing truck blockages, burning trucks, but this perhaps not during this protest, but in previous protests, preventing goods from being ferried. And, you know, then we talk about the load shedding issue, which is hampering every sector, every individual, every business in the country comes to a dead standstill. And there are many more examples we can give. I mean, I'm just giving you things that we've seen happening this particular week. So we know that we have a major issue. And unfortunately, when we look at the way government is handling all of this, it seems that they hamstrung, that to deal with Transnet, to deal with Eskom, to deal with the likes of an SAA, they're not able to do anything about it, and the situation is getting worse and worse and worse. So where does the solution lie?
It cannot be resolved by privatization. It can be resolved by removing the ineffective government from government, because it is failing. That's where the failure is. It is not a matter of privatizing, because even if you were to privatize, and indeed people will go and block the highway, and then of course the private sector will say, bring the police, bring the army, shoot them and kill them. That's where the problem is going to be once these things are privatized. Because once they are privatized, the prices will shoot through the roof and will be unaffordable. We have to understand the developmental challenge of South Africa. And it is through the developmental state, and through the developmental state that is both regulatory and developmental, rather than exhort a developmental state which is only regulatory. And when it is regulatory and developmental, it means its population, its populace that is executing, it's well equipped to do those things that are necessarily developmental. All developmental states have the key assets such as electricity, transport, and so on under the state command. And then it eases the basis for private sector to thrive. But in all those developmental states, the key people that are driving this are knowledgeable, are well equipped to do so, and they intersect with the private sector very well. In South Africa, it is not the problem of state ownership. It is the problem of a government that is failing to execute its developmental mandate. It has hung on the regulatory aspect, and through defunding things like Eskom, defunding things like SAA, things failed to work. People got angry, and now the classical solution of privatization is ripe for the private sector to take these things for scrap. That's the solution. And the Eskom has been said to be privatized. Of course, at the moment they say no, Eskom is not being privatized, but they are saying production will be in the private hands and the grid will be in the state. You cannot run the grid without vertical integration of that system. If parts of it are privatized for generation, the private sector will be giving will actually raise the prices. Let's look at California under Enron. The private sector is naturally greedy. Yeah. And Enron is a classical example. The UK privatized the rail, and the private sector got greedy, and there were accidents on the rail, and until the UK actually regrouped and got the rail under control. In Canada, where energy was failing, and solution towards privatization was offered, and the Canadian government sit back a bit and said, no, we'll sponsor and we'll finance this through the fiscals. And that generation in Canada is working very well and is seeing profits. So privatization is not a solution to state-owned enterprises that have a developmental purpose.
You said something so interesting.
If you only stick to the regulatory frame, then you fail.
Paddy, let me interrupt you there. I mean, you said something so interesting, and you said the private sector is greedy. And that's the reality, is the private sector are in it to make money. The state, however, it feels like there are individuals that are in it to make money, because it seems like we're stuck in this void right now where, you know, do we turn to the private sector? Because we know if we go to the private sector, things will get more expensive. I mean, we just look at what's happening in the airline industry. And I know Dawie was sort of trying to defend the airline industry, but no, the reality is that ever since we've seen the collapse of so many airlines and the struggling, limping SAA, prices have gone through the ceiling. To get to Cape Town is almost impossible these days with the prices. So there is a grand example. We know that if Eskom is privatized, we are going to pay more and more and more money. People are going to lose their jobs, and that's the way it's going to be. No subsidizing coming our way. And the private, yes, we may have an efficient electricity supply, but it'll only be for a select portion of South Africans, and that's where the problem comes in. However, so we know these two scenarios, but when we look at what the situation is happening here, the very state that claims to be driving this developmental agenda have failed to maximize opportunities and create employment. They failed to drive infrastructure programs. They failed in industrialization, despite talking about it all the time. That is all they talk about, and yet it's not happening. And all that is happening is that South Africans are not working and are depending more and more on grants. So we're stuck. Where do we go from here?
Well, the problem is the government is poorly managed. It's completely failing. But privatization is not the solution. The problem is in the people that are in positions of power, without being adequately equipped to be in power. That's where the problem is. So we have to bite the bullet. Privatization is going to lead to more misery, and those who are in power now will be exiting and making deals with the private sector to leave the population of South Africa much more miserable. The solution is not in privatization. The solution is in agreeing that we need to be a developmental state, and that developmental state must be led by competent people. At the moment, at the top level of government, we are completely incompetent. And therefore, we have chosen an incompetent government, and that is why it is failing. It's not about privatization. When you compare the apartheid government, it had engineers, it had people that understood. I went to this place called Orania, mobilizing the census in 2011, sitting with Boshoff there. He was surrounded by doctors, by engineers, by everything. And when you looked at Orania, remove the apartheid from it, because it is an apartheid and they can be tolerated for that reason. But having put that aside and looking at how Orania municipality is run, you see a person in communications. They are not about spinning the communications. They are talking about the development of Orania. Around them are people who actually execute the development of Orania. And you can see it on the ground. It's not spin, it's not big flags, it's not anything, but it is actually about the skills of the people on the ground who execute. This is where we are failing. And that is in the power and in the hands of government. And it is a government that is failing completely.
So, Paddy, let's try and work out something here, because we keep saying the government is failing, and we will never keep quiet, and we need to hold them account for everything they're doing. Because, I mean, you know, it baffles the mind when you look at a country that's experiencing high levels of corruption and lawlessness. I mean, if you take an example, let's look at something like Charlotte Maxeke. The state is paying 40 million rand a year to security to guard the hospital. Now, where does that money go? I mean, because it doesn't, you know, it's not working. And that's just one example. That's 40 million rand, where that is happening all over the place, in every municipality, in buildings and government-owned places all the time. And the reality is this creates a sense of hopelessness. And we talk about voting, you know, 2024, hold the ANC to account, get them out of power. But where do we go? Because we're seeing coalition governments failing everywhere right now. So how do we find hope? How do we turn this around?
You see, economic policies matter. And the design of those policies actually count. To the extent that we are following a neoliberal policy whatever government that goes into power following this kind of policies will not succeed. Apartheid followed a particular way of designing the economy. And of course, with sanctions, they became even much more creative, inward-looking, developed things. It is about economic policies. It's not about the political rhetoric. And that political rhetoric going to 2024 will be coalitions, and they'll be rubbing each other's back and will be in even deeper crisis, making things ripe for the private sector to hive off whatever there remains, and then the Gwara situation, the space of enclaves, and a country that is in despair emerges. A deeper Gwara is going to emerge. Policies, economic policies, and their design matter. Defund, make sure that things don't work, people get angry, and privatize. That's the standard privatization solution under neoliberal conditions, and we are under that. So let's make ourselves clear that for as long as we pursue these neoliberal policies, we'll be in this kind of situation forever. It is avoiding and removing the neoliberal policies from the agenda of funding those things that matter, ensuring that they are equipped with the people that matter, and then we move forward. For as long as we go to borrow from the IMF, 8.5 billion that is given to us, which is in loans and subsidies from the so-called just transition, when we have 3 trillion in government pensions and 17 trillion in all pensions in the country, instead of investing those our resources and holding ourselves responsible for our resources. That's the way we'll go. These borrowings that we are making are because the state is afraid that if we went to our pensions, we'll steal them. And therefore, borrowed money may save us from stealing. The point is we are failing to confront the stealing and the policies that encourage stealing. As long as we do that, we are not going to go away. This is not going to go away.
Yeah.
Dawie Roodt, or whoever is about privatization, it will still not work. But of course, they will create police, they'll create the army, and then they'll create enclaves that will shoot at the poor when they try to claim and live a living. That's what's going to happen.
Paddy, I'm going to leave it there because I think you've given us a lot to think about, and it certainly is. We find ourselves in a very difficult position as a country because we need things to work, although we need it to be available to the wider population as well, because privatizing makes things expensive. But as it stands now, when things don't work, it makes it impossible. So we got to find that balance in between there. It's a long discussion. SA's former Statistician-General Pali Lehohla weighing in on whether privatization of state entities and infrastructure facilities would be the best way to go in stabilizing the country's economy amid state inefficiencies.